He slammed his glass down so hard the wine splashed across the white tablecloth like a wound. "Look at this thing," Dario Bellucci said, loud enough for the entire dining hall to hear. He wasn't talking about the wine. He was talking about her. Mirelle Ashcroft stood frozen, the empty bottle still in her hand, red spreading across Dario's shirt, a shirt that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The whole room went silent. 20 of the most dangerous men in New York, and not one of them moved. Dario leaned back in his chair and smiled the way men smile when they know no one will stop them. "They sent me a maid who can't even pour without making a mess." His eyes traveled over her body with deliberate cruelty. "Though I suppose when you're that size, it's hard to control anything." The laughter started slow. Then it spread. If you've ever stood in a room full of people laughing at you, not with you, at you, then you already know exactly what Mirelle felt in that moment. That particular kind of silence inside your own chest, that heat behind your eyes you refuse to let become tears. Ask yourself honestly, what would you have done? If you've ever been dismissed, humiliated, or made to feel like you didn't belong somewhere, stay with us. Because what happened next in that dining hall changed everything. Don't go anywhere. If this is your first time finding this channel, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss a story. And while you're watching, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Blackwater Manor, where the night Mirelle Ashcroft became impossible to ignore was just getting started. The agency told her the job would be simple. That was the first lie. The second lie was the photograph on the brochure, a sun-drenched estate with white curtains billowing through open windows, all salt air and seagulls, and the kind of quiet that rich people buy and poor people dream about. Blackwater Manor looked nothing like that in person. It rose up from the cliffs above the Atlantic like something that had always been there, older than the road that led to it, built from dark stone that absorbed light instead of reflecting it. When the agency van dropped Mirelle at the front gate on a gray Tuesday morning in November, her first thought wasn't beautiful. Her first thought was careful. She'd learned that instinct the hard way. 12 years cleaning other people's houses taught you things that no job listing ever mentioned. The way a messy bedroom told a different story than a spotless one. The way certain silences in certain hallways meant you kept your head down and your feet moving. The way some employers looked through you like you were part of the furniture, and others looked at you in ways that made you want to lock the bathroom door from the inside. Mirelle was 34 years old, 5'4", and a size 18 on a good day. She had a voice she rarely used and hands that were always steady. She wasn't beautiful by any standard that Manhattan society recognized, and she'd made her peace with that somewhere around age 22, after the third boyfriend and the fourth job interview told her in different ways that she would have to work twice as hard to get half as far. So she did. She showed up early. She stayed late. She never broke anything. She never took anything. She never complained when the Hendersons on Fifth Avenue left a week's worth of dishes accidentally piled in the sink right before her arrival, or when Mrs. Pavlenko in Tribeca docked her pay for a scratch in the hardwood that had been there since the Clinton administration. You smile. You nod. You clean the thing they didn't ask you to clean. You become so reliable, so quiet, so present without presence that they forget you're capable of thought. That was the trick. That was how you survived. The man who opened Blackwater Manor's front gate was not a butler. He had the neck of someone who'd carried things heavier than luggage, and his jacket sat wrong across his shoulders in a way Mirelle recognized immediately. The particular hang of fabric over something that shouldn't be there. He looked at her the way men like him always looked at women like her, long enough to confirm she wasn't a threat, short enough to communicate she wasn't worth remembering. "Ashcroft?" he said. "Yes." "Kitchen entrance is around the side." He didn't point. He just looked at the side of the house and expected her to understand. She understood. The housekeeper who met her at the kitchen door was a compact Hungarian woman named Vera, who moved like she was always slightly late for something. She handed Mirelle a laminated sheet of rules before she'd even set her bag down. "No phones in the East Wing," Vera said. "No entering Mr. Varelli's study unless he requests it. No discussion of guests or visitors with anyone outside this property. No exceptions." She paused, tapping the laminated sheet. "This part." She pointed to a line Mirelle hadn't reached yet. "You see rooms with closed doors, they stay closed. You don't ask what's behind them. You don't wonder out loud. You clean what you're assigned to clean and nothing else. Understood, Mirelle said. Vera looked at her for a moment with something that wasn't quite sympathy. You did reference checks with the agency? I always do. Then you know the pay rate is double standard. Yes. You know why it's double? Mirelle looked at her steadily. Because they need someone discreet. Vera held her gaze for 2 full seconds, then nodded once and handed her a set of keys. Breakfast starts at 6. Mr. Virelli eats alone. You clean his private rooms only when he's not in them. Any questions? Mirelle had approximately 40 questions. She asked 0 of them. She spent her first week at Blackwater Manor the way she spent the first week everywhere, watching. Not in a suspicious way. In the way that women who survive by being unnoticed always watch. She cataloged the rhythms of the house, which guard rotated where and at what hour, which corridors were busy in the morning and empty by noon, which rooms collected dust fastest, meaning they weren't used often, and which ones she was never assigned to touch, meaning they were used constantly but by people who cleaned up after themselves. That second category made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She saw Cassian Virelli for the first time on a Thursday. He was coming down the main staircase when she was crossing the foyer, and he moved the way certain men move. Not quickly, not urgently, but with the absolute certainty that nothing in the room would require him to change course. He was taller than she'd expected. The photographs in the industry press, the ones she'd found when she Googled his name her first night using the guest Wi-Fi, showed a man in boardrooms and charity galas, always in perfectly fitted charcoal suits, always with the same expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a threat, but occupied some interesting territory between them. In person, he looked harder, more tired, like the suit was doing a lot of work. He didn't look at her, not a flicker of acknowledgement. She was part of the floor he walked across. She kept moving. But she noticed, in her peripheral vision, that he paused at the base of the stairs for just a moment, the briefest hesitation, like something had snagged his attention, before continuing toward the east wing. She didn't let herself wonder about it. She had rules about wondering. The blood appeared on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks into her assignment. She almost walked past the library door. She'd cleaned it twice already that week, and it wasn't on her morning list. But the door was open, cracked just an inch, the way doors sit when they haven't been properly latched. And through that inch she could smell something she recognized. Copper. The distinct, almost metallic sweetness of blood. She stood in the hallway for 8 full seconds. She counted. She counted because it kept her from making a decision based purely on fear, and fear was the thing most likely to get her killed in this house if she acted on it wrong. Then she pushed the door open. The Persian rug, hand-knotted, antique, the kind of thing that belonged behind velvet rope in a museum, was soaked in a dark stain near the reading chairs. Not a huge amount, not a movie amount, but enough. Enough that someone had bled seriously, recently, and then been moved. The shell casing caught the morning light from the window, sitting against the baseboard like it had rolled there and given up. Mirelle's heart was going very fast and very loud. She walked to the supply closet off the hallway, got what she needed, and came back. She did not think about what she was doing. Thinking about it would have paralyzed her. Instead, she did what she'd always done when the thing in front of her was overwhelming, but she broke it into tasks. This spot. This area. The casing goes in her apron pocket, wrapped in a cleaning cloth. The rug. The rug was a problem, but hydrogen peroxide on natural fiber if you moved fast enough. You're good at this. The voice came from the doorway. Mirelle did not scream. She didn't drop anything. She turned around slowly, because turning around fast was the kind of thing that read as guilty, and she was not guilty of anything except being thorough. Cassian Virelli stood in the doorway of his own library with his arms crossed and his head tilted slightly to one side, watching her the way you watch something you weren't expecting to find interesting. Most people, he said, would have left. Most people, Mirelle said before she could think better of it, aren't carrying a bottle of hydrogen peroxide. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Close to one. How long? He asked. 15 minutes, if the fiber hasn't set too deep. She turned back to the rug. I'd rather not waste it talking. He didn't say anything for a moment. She could feel him watching her. It was different from the way other people didn't watch her. The studied invisibility that most employers practiced. This was the opposite. This was attention so direct it had weight. "You're not going to ask what happened," he said. "No." "Why not?" She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "Because you're not going to tell me, and asking is going to make us both uncomfortable, and I still have 4 other rooms on my list this morning." This time, something did move across his face, something she couldn't quite name. "Carry on," he said quietly, and he left. She finished the rug in 11 minutes. The shell casing she wrapped carefully and deposited in the outdoor waste bin under a layer of kitchen scraps. The cloth she used went into the incinerator in the laundry room, which she noted had been recently used by someone else and recently cleared. She went on with her morning. But she knew, with the particular certainty of someone who had survived by reading rooms, that something had just changed. She didn't know what yet. She didn't know if it was good or terrible, and she suspected, with the small practical part of her brain, that she'd always trusted more than her feelings, that it might be both. The thing no one tells you about being overlooked your entire life is that when someone finally looks, really looks, it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like danger. Within a week, things began shifting around her in ways she couldn't immediately explain. The meal she was handed at the kitchen table she'd been eating standing up, picking from whatever was left after the household staff finished, was suddenly a full plate, still hot, set at the actual table. Vera said nothing about it, didn't explain it, just slid it in front of her like that's how it had always been. The guard who used to watch her cross the back garden every morning with the particular boredom of someone who trusted nobody, now nodded at her. Just once, just slightly. But he nodded. And then the clothing appeared. Not her uniform. Her uniform was the standard agency issue, navy blue, loose, designed to be unnoticeable. What appeared in her room one evening, hanging in the small wardrobe, was a black dress in her actual size, cut properly, fitted at the waist. Not flashy, not inappropriate, just right. The kind of garment that knew what it was doing. There was no note. Mirelle sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, looking at it. She was not naive. She understood that expensive gifts from powerful men came with costs. She wasn't always shown in advance. She'd been down that road before, not with men this dangerous, but with men who thought generosity entitled them to something, and she'd paid for every one of those lessons. But something about this felt different, something she couldn't articulate yet. She left the dress hanging in the wardrobe and wore her uniform the next morning. The morning Dario Bellucci arrived with his people, the whole energy of the house changed before he walked through the door. Mirelle felt it, the guards tightening, the household staff suddenly very focused on being somewhere specific, the low current of tension that moved through the walls the way cold air moves through old houses. She'd learned to read houses the way she read people. This one was scared, not of Bellucci specifically, of what his presence meant. She was serving the pre-dinner wine when he arrived with 6 men and the particular energy of someone who'd spent decades being the most dangerous person in every room he entered. I was heavy-set, silver-haired, with eyes that assessed and dismissed in the same motion. He sat at the long dinner table like he owned it. She moved carefully. She was always careful. But Dario Bellucci, she would learn, was the kind of man who created accidents on purpose. When his elbow caught the wine bottle as she passed, she knew in the half-second before the glass tipped, that it wasn't an accident. The wine went across his shirt. The bottle rolled. The room held its breath. And then Dario Bellucci stood up, looked directly at her, and said the thing he said. The thing about her size. The thing about making a mess. The thing that was designed, precisely and deliberately, to make everyone in the room laugh and to make her feel that she had earned what was happening to her. The laughter came. It always came. Mirelle held the empty bottle and looked at the middle distance and breathed through her nose and thought, with the steady, exhausted clarity of someone who had done this before. Don't cry. Don't apologize. Don't run. Just stand here. You've survived worse than this. And then she heard the chair scrape. Slowly. Deliberately. The laughter stopped. Cassian Virelli rose from his seat at the head of the table. He didn't move fast. He moved the way he always moved, with absolute certainty that nothing in the room would require him to change course. He crossed the length of the dining hall in the kind of silence that made 20 dangerous men hold completely still. He stopped beside Dario Bellucci. He reached into his jacket. The knife he pressed against Dario's throat was small, almost elegant, and it was there so fast that Dario's own men didn't have time to reach for their weapons before they understood that reaching would be the last thing they ever did. "Apologize," Cassian said. His voice was very quiet. That was the part that terrified people, Mirelle realized. Not the knife. The quiet. Dario's jaw worked. His eyes cut to his men, who were not moving. His face had gone the specific color of a man recalculating very quickly. "Cassian, to her," Cassian said. "Now." The silence in the dining hall was the loudest thing Mirelle had ever heard. Dario Bellucci, the man his own people called Il Re, the king, the man who had made 3 mayors and 2 federal judges afraid of their own names, looked at a plus-sized maid in a navy uniform holding an empty wine bottle, and he said, through a clenched jaw and a carefully blank face, "My apologies." Cassian lowered the knife. He returned to his seat. He picked up his wine glass and drank from it like nothing had happened. The dinner continued. Mirelle set the empty bottle down on the sideboard and went back to work. Because that was what you did. That was always what you did. You kept working. You didn't let your hands shake where anyone could see them. But inside, something had cracked open in her chest. Something she didn't have a name for yet. In 34 years, nobody had ever stopped a room for her. Nobody had ever chosen her dignity over their politics, their alliances, their carefully maintained peace with men who could hurt them. She didn't know what to do with it. She carried it with her the way you carry something fragile, carefully, without examining it too directly, because you're afraid if you look at it straight on, you'll discover it's smaller than you thought, or already broken, or never really yours to begin with. That night she heard them talking in the courtyard below her window. She wasn't eavesdropping. She was getting water from the small bathroom off her room, and the window was cracked an inch because the radiator ran hot, and the voices carried in the cold November air with the particular clarity that empty space provides. Cassian's voice. 2 others she recognized as senior men. The words came in fragments. Bellucci at the harbor. Wednesday. Once it's done, the Eastern contracts move to us. She stood very still. Clean and final. "I don't want another conversation after this one." She stepped back from the window. Her hand was pressed against her own sternum, like she was trying to keep something inside her chest from escaping. Clean and final. She knew what that meant. She'd known, in some abstract way, since the blood on the rug and the shell casing and the guards who carried things under their jackets. She'd known, and she'd chosen, deliberately and practically, not to know. Because knowing changed what she was responsible for. And she couldn't afford responsibility that might cost her this job, this income, her mother's care. But now she'd heard it. Actually heard it. There was no unknowing it. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a very long time. Then she pulled her bag from under the bed and began quietly, carefully, to pack. She packed the way she cleaned, methodically, without wasted motion. The black dress stayed on the hanger. She didn't touch it. She folded her own clothes, the ones she'd brought, the ones that belonged to her life before Blackwater Manor, and she placed them in her bag with the careful efficiency of someone who had moved enough times to know exactly how much space grief takes up when you fold it properly. Her hands were steady. That surprised her, a little. Her hands were almost always steady. It was the one thing she trusted about herself unconditionally. In 12 years of cleaning up other people's chaos, her hands had never shaken where anyone could see them. They weren't shaking now, but her chest felt like a fist had closed around something inside it and wasn't letting go. She wrote the resignation letter at the small desk beside the window. She kept it short because short letters couldn't be argued with. Personal reasons. Effective immediately. Thank you for the opportunity. She signed it with her full name, Mirelle Catherine Ashcroft, the way her mother had taught her, like your name was something worth the space it took up on the page. She set the letter on the desk where Vera would find it in the morning. Then she sat down on the edge of the bed and waited for 4 a.m. She'd calculated it. The guard rotation she'd memorized over 3 weeks told her there was a 14-minute window between shifts at the front gate, long enough to get through, not long enough to get caught, if she moved at the right pace. She'd spent enough mornings watching this house breathe to know its rhythms better than most people who lived in it. That was the thing about being invisible. You learned everything. At 3:58, she picked up her bag. At 3:59, she was in the hallway. At 4:02, she was at the top of the main staircase, and Cassian Virelli was standing at the bottom of it. I wasn't holding anything. He wasn't blocking the stairs exactly. He was just standing there in the dark entryway in a charcoal shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, like a man who'd never gone to bed at all, and he was looking up at her with an expression she couldn't read quickly enough. Mirelle didn't stop moving. She came down the stairs because stopping would have been worse. Stopping would have looked like guilt, and she wasn't guilty. She was leaving, which was her absolute right as a human being and an employee, and she held that thought like a shield. She reached the bottom step and held out the resignation letter. He looked at it. He didn't take it. "You overheard us," he said. Not a question. "I'd like to leave now," she said. "The letter can wait." "The letter is my notice. I'm giving it to you directly because I couldn't find Vera, and He took the letter from her hand and without looking at it, without ceremony, he tore it in half. Then he tore the halves into quarters. He set the pieces on the entryway table with the careful precision of someone making a point. Mirelle stared at the pieces of paper. The specific, intimate violence of watching her own words get destroyed in front of her sent something hot up her spine that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but occupied the exact space between them. "You can't do that," she said. "It's done. That was my resignation." "I know what it was." "Then you know I'm leaving." "Mirelle." He said her name the way you say something you've been thinking about. Not casually, not performatively. Like it had weight. "You heard half a conversation through a window at midnight. You're making a decision based on that." "I heard enough." "You heard a conclusion. You didn't hear the context." "I don't need the context." Her voice was steady. She was very proud of how steady it was. "I need to not be here. And you tearing up my letter doesn't change that because I can walk out that door without a letter. And you can't legally. I'm not going to stop you legally." That landed wrong. The way he said it. The quiet specificity of legally. She shifted her bag on her shoulder and looked at him directly. "Then you're going to stop me some other way. I'm going to ask you to sit down and let me explain something. It's 4 a.m. Yes. I've been awake since midnight. I know. I heard you moving." That detail. The simple, almost domestic fact that he'd been awake listening to her move through the room above him did something complicated to the heat in her chest. She didn't examine it. She didn't have time to examine it. "One conversation," he said. "Then if you still want to leave, I'll have someone drive you wherever you need to go." "Why?" "Because you deserve that much." She looked at him for a long moment. A long, measuring, exhausted moment in which she weighed every instinct she had against every piece of practical sense she'd accumulated in 34 years of surviving situations that should have been simple but weren't. Then she set her bag down at the foot of the stairs. "One conversation," she said. He led her not to the library. She noted that, the deliberate choice of a different room, but to a smaller sitting room off the west corridor that she'd cleaned twice and never seen occupied. He turned on a single lamp. There was coffee already made, which told her he'd been planning this longer than the last 4 minutes, which told her something she stored away without commenting on. She sat. She didn't take the coffee. He sat across from her and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the morning in the library, like she was something he was still figuring out. "What you heard," he said, "was a business decision. I understand what it was. I need you to understand specifically what it was." His jaw moved. Dario Bellucci has been moving product through the Eastern Harbor for 8 months using infrastructure that belongs to 3 other families. He's skimming from all of them and blaming the losses on Port Authority interference. 2 weeks ago, one of those families lost a man because of something Bellucci set in motion and then let someone else take the blame for. He paused. "This isn't a decision I made over dinner because he embarrassed you. This decision was made 6 weeks ago by people who've been watching him longer than you've been in this house." Mirelle looked at him steadily. "You're explaining this to me." "Yes." "You're explaining the operational logic of a murder to your housekeeper." Something flickered across his face, not defensiveness, something more tired than that. "I'm explaining it to you because you're smart enough to have already made a decision that affects your safety, and I need you to have accurate information before you make it permanent." "My safety." She let that sit for a second. "My safety is why you're telling me this." "Partly." "What's the other part?" He held her gaze. "You saved a priceless rug and a significant amount of trouble, and you didn't ask for anything in return and you didn't run. That's not common." "I ran tonight." "You tried to." He almost smiled. It didn't quite finish. You didn't make it past the stairs. She pressed her lips together. That's not a compliment. It wasn't meant to be one. I'm telling you that you are not in danger from me. I'm telling you that if you leave this house tonight and go back to your regular life, you are potentially in danger from the people who will notice that you are here for the next 3 to 4 weeks. And I'm telling you that the safest place for you right now is inside this property with people who have reason to make sure you're all right. The silence after that was a very specific kind of silence. The kind where you know you've heard something true and you wish you hadn't. You're saying, I know too much to be safe outside. I'm saying the timing is complicated. How long? 2 weeks, maybe 3. And after that? After that, you leave with a full severance, a reference letter from the agency director personally, and every reason to forget this assignment existed. Mirelle looked at her hands on her knees. She thought about her mother in the care facility in Queens, the twice-weekly calls, the slow progress, the bills that arrived with the relentlessness of weather. She thought about the 14-minute window in the guard rotation she'd never get to use now. She thought about the way Cassian had crossed a dining room full of dangerous men to press a knife against someone's throat because of something that was said to her. She thought, this is how people get trapped, not by chains, by reasons that make sense. I want one thing, she said. He waited. I don't want anyone telling me where I can go in this house or when. I'm not a guest you're managing, and I'm not a prisoner. If I'm staying as someone who moves freely. He considered that for exactly 3 seconds. Within reason. No, freely. She held his gaze. Those are my terms. One conversation, and then I'm telling you mine. Something shifted in how he was sitting. Not quite respect. Something adjacent to it. All right, he said. She picked up the coffee. It was very good coffee. She didn't tell him that. The next morning, she went back to work. Not because she'd made peace with anything. She hadn't. Not because she trusted him. She didn't exactly, in the way you don't trust a river even when you know how to swim. But because the practical math of her situation had been laid out in front of her at 4 in the morning, and Mirelle had always been better at math than at feelings. She cleaned the east corridor. She cleaned the morning room. She stripped and remade the guest rooms from the Bellucci visit with the particular satisfaction of removing all physical evidence that those men had ever been comfortable in a space she was responsible for. She worked at her normal pace, which was slightly faster than most people expected and significantly more thorough. Vera found her at 9:15 in the upstairs linen closet, taking inventory. You're still here, Vera said. Yes. Vera looked at her for a moment. Then she handed her a fresh stack of cleaning cloths and walked away without another word, which was, Mirelle had come to understand, Vera's version of a warm welcome. What changed that day was subtle enough that she almost missed it. The guard who rotated through the east corridor, a broad-shouldered man named Reyes who'd spoken exactly 4 words to her in 3 weeks, fell into step a few paces behind her when she moved from room to room. Not close, not intrusive, but present. When she stopped, he stopped. When she moved, he moved. She turned and looked at him directly. Am I being supervised? No, ma'am. Then why are you following me? He looked straight ahead at a fixed point somewhere above her left shoulder. Mr. Varelli's instructions. His instructions are for you to follow me around while I clean bathrooms? The faintest tension moved through Reyes's jaw. His instructions are for me to make sure you're safe, ma'am. Mirelle looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to her cart and continued down the corridor, because arguing with Reyes was going to be approximately as productive as arguing with the wall behind him, and she had 4 bathrooms left. But something had shifted in her chest, and she was very deliberately not looking at it. It was Marco who cracked first. Marco was Cassian's second, younger than he looked at first glance, with the tight-wound energy of someone who'd grown up having to be faster than the people around him to stay alive. He had been watching Mirelle with poorly concealed suspicion since her first day, and the suspicion had not improved following the Dario dinner. She felt his eyes on her back in corridors. She heard his voice drop when she entered rooms where he was talking. She was mopping the courtyard stones. She'd taken to doing the outdoor work in the afternoons when the light was better and the air had some movement in it. When Marco came out and stood in the doorway and watched her work for long enough that ignoring him stopped being polite and started being intentional. She kept mopping. You've been here 5 weeks, he said. I know how long I've been here. Most housekeepers don't make it past 2. He came a step into the courtyard. The last one left because she saw something that scared her. "I've seen things that scared me," Mirelle said, without stopping. "And you stayed." "And I stayed." "Why?" She paused, wrung out the mop, and looked at him. Marco had the face of someone who'd learned to read people for survival and was currently reading her and not getting a result he understood, which was making him angry in the low, controlled way of men who've trained themselves not to show anger until it's useful. "Because I needed the income," she said. "That's it. That's the whole answer." "The whole answer," he repeated. "Yes. Not because the boss suddenly decided you eat at the table and get driven wherever you need to go and have Reyes following you around like a... Marco!" The voice came from the corridor behind him. Marco turned. Cassian was standing at the far end of the courtyard entrance. He hadn't raised his voice. He never raised his voice. But Marco went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a temperature drops. Not dramatically, just completely. "She has work to finish," Cassian said. "So do you." Marco held still for 1 second too many. The particular defiance of a man who knew better but needed the 1 second anyway. Then he walked back inside. Cassian looked at Mirelle. She looked back at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "He was wasting your time. He was asking reasonable questions. He was making you uncomfortable." "I don't get uncomfortable," she said, which was not entirely true but was true enough. "I get practical." Something moved across his face. "That's what I mean," he said, almost to himself, and went back inside. Mirelle stood in the courtyard holding the mop and thought, for approximately the 100th time, that she did not understand this man at all. She was not sure, and this was the part that alarmed her, that she wanted to stop trying. The designer arrived on a Tuesday. Not a stylist, not a personal shopper. A designer, a thin, precise woman named Celeste, who arrived with an assistant and 2 rolling racks and set up in the upstairs sitting room with the competence of someone who had been told exactly what she needed and brought exactly that. She was looking for Mirelle before Mirelle knew there was anyone looking. "I need 20 minutes, Celeste said when Vera delivered the message. "For what?" Mirelle asked. "Measurements, fittings. Mr. Virelli has a formal event in 10 days. He requires appropriate attire for his household staff in attendance." Mirelle looked at her for a moment. "The household staff attending a formal event. Specifically you." Celeste checked her clipboard. "Mirelle Ashcroft. You're the only name on my list." She stood in the upstairs sitting room and let Celeste's assistant wrap a measuring tape around her waist, her hips, the circumference of her shoulders, with the professional efficiency of someone who measured bodies the way carpenters measured wood, accurately, without opinion. Celeste called out numbers and her assistant wrote them down, and nothing in either woman's manner suggested that Mirelle's body was anything other than a set of facts to be accounted for. She had been measured before by people who used the tape like a verdict. This was different. It made her more uncomfortable, not less. Because she knew how to handle dismissal. She'd had 20 years of practice. What she didn't have practice with was being treated like someone worth accommodating. "The color?" Celeste asked, holding 2 swatches. "I don't need to choose a color," Mirelle said. "I don't even know why I'm attending this event." "Deep green," Celeste said, ignoring the second part entirely, holding the swatch to Mirelle's collarbone with a professional tilt of her head. "Yes, this." She was gone within the hour. Mirelle went back to work and did not think about it. She did not think about it for approximately 3 hours, and then she went to find Cassian. He was in the smaller study on the ground floor. Not the library, she noticed again. He'd stopped using the library, or at least he'd stopped being in it when she might encounter him there, with a phone against his ear and 3 open folders on the desk. He saw her come in and held up one finger without breaking his conversation. She stood and waited, which she resented slightly, but she waited. When he ended the call, he looked at her. "The event in 10 days, she said. "The Whitmore Foundation dinner. Annual charity function. Half of my business relationships exist in that room." "You don't need your housekeeper at a charity dinner." "No," he agreed. "Then what am I there for?" He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with that particular measuring expression she'd come to recognize as his version of deciding how much to say. "Dario Bellucci will be there," he said. "His last public appearance before the situation is resolved. Several people in that room will be watching to see how I respond to last week's incident." The incident where you put a knife to his throat in front of his whole delegation. Yes. And having me there is a response to that. Having you there with me is a statement. That he doesn't scare you. That the apology was sincere, he paused, and that what I choose to protect is my business. The room held very still for a moment. Mirelle looked at him. You want to use me to send a message? I want to take you to a dinner. Those aren't the same thing. No, he said after a moment. They're not. And something in the way he said it made her realize he was aware of that distinction, and that it was bothering him, and that he hadn't fully resolved it, which was perhaps the most human she'd ever seen him look. She went back to her room and stood at the window for a long time. She did not take out her phone. She did not call her mother because it was late and her mother needed sleep, and because there was nothing she could say that she'd be able to explain. She just stood at the window and watched the water move below the cliffs, dark and constant and indifferent, and she thought about the difference between being used and being chosen, and how sometimes the distance between them was so narrow you could convince yourself you couldn't see it. The dress arrived 2 days later, deep green, her size. Not the agency uniform size, not the size that manufacturing assumed, but her actual size, every seam and cut accounting for the specific geography of her body. She stood in her room and looked at it for so long she lost track of time. Then she tried it on. She didn't look at herself in the mirror right away. She pulled it on, let the fabric settle, adjusted the neckline, and then she looked. She looked for a long time. She couldn't remember the last time she'd looked at herself in a mirror, and didn't immediately start cataloging the things she wished were different. The instinct was so old it operated below the level of thought. But standing in that room in that dress, she noticed she wasn't cataloging. She was just looking. She took the dress off and hung it back up and went and made herself tea, and did not, under any circumstances, let herself make anything of that moment. The night before the Whitmore dinner, Marco came to find her again. It was late. After 10, the house quiet except for the usual background noise of men keeping watch. She was in the kitchen making tea, which was apparently when people found her because it was the only time she sat still long enough to be found. Marco sat down across from her without being invited. He'd dropped the thin pretense of professional hostility. What replaced it was something rawer and, she thought, more honest. I need to say something to you, he said. All right. I don't trust you. He said it without inflection, which she respected. I don't mean you're untrustworthy. I mean I haven't decided yet, and in this work, undecided is the same as no. He put both hands flat on the table. But Cassian does. Trust you. Not fully. He doesn't fully trust anyone. It's not how he's built. But more than he trusts most people who've been in this house for 5 years. And that means whatever happens to you also happens to him. You understand what I'm telling you? Mirelle wrapped both hands around her mug. You're telling me to be careful with him. Marco looked at her. I'm telling you that he's the kind of man who only does something once. When it's real, he doesn't perform it. He doesn't practice it. He just does it. He paused. I've worked for him for 9 years. I've watched him negotiate with people who wanted him dead, lose people he'd known since he was 16, rebuild things from nothing twice. I've never seen him put a knife to someone's throat at a dinner table over anyone. His jaw tightened. So yeah, be careful. He stood up. He left. Mirelle sat with her tea in the empty kitchen and listened to the house settle around her and felt something happening in her chest that she recognized distantly as the beginning of something she hadn't planned for. She was still telling herself it was manageable. She kept telling herself that right up until the moment, 2 mornings later, when Cassian walked into the kitchen while she was eating breakfast and sat down across from her and looked at her with that specific expression, the one that was not quite a smile and not quite a threat, and occupied the interesting territory between them, and said quietly, "Tell me something true about yourself, something that isn't in any file." She looked at him across the table. She set down her fork. And Mirelle Catherine Ashcroft, who had survived 34 years by being invisible, opened her mouth and told the most dangerous man she'd ever met something she'd never told anyone. The room shifted around that moment, like water moving around a stone, and she understood, in the way she always understood things, too late to stop them, too clearly to pretend otherwise, that she had just passed a threshold she wasn't going to be able to step back over. She told him about her mother's hands. That was the thing she said. Not about the bills, not about the diagnosis, not about the specific weight of watching someone who used to braid your hair. Forget your name in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. She told him that her mother had the kind of hands that always knew what to do. In the kitchen, in an argument, in the particular silence after something broke that couldn't be fixed. And that the cruelest thing about what was happening to her mother's mind wasn't the forgetting. It was that her hands still moved sometimes, still reached for things that weren't there, still opened and closed the way they did when she was solving a problem, even when the problem-solving part of her was already gone. Cassian listened without moving. When she finished, he didn't offer condolence. He didn't perform sympathy. He said, "How long has she been at the facility?" 14 months. "Is it a good facility?" She looked at her hands on the table. "It's an adequate facility. Good ones cost 3 times what I make in a year." He was quiet for a moment. What would good look like? It would look like someone knowing her name every day. Someone sitting with her. More staff per patient, not less. She stopped. "You're asking me to describe something I've spent 14 months pretending I'm not angry about not being able to give her." "I know," he said. "Tell me anyway." She told him. She didn't mean to tell him all of it. She told him the way you tell things when you're tired and it's early and the person across from you isn't flinching, a little more than you intended, and then a little more, and then you're past the point where stopping feels like anything other than cowardice. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Eat your breakfast," and stood up and left. She sat there and stared at her eggs and thought, what just happened? She didn't find out until 3 days later. Vera called her into the small office off the kitchen with the expression of someone delivering news they've been told not to contextualize. She handed Mirelle a single sheet of paper, an account statement, a facility letterhead, a zero balance where a number with too many digits used to live. Mirelle stared at it. "The account was cleared 2 days ago," Vera said. "Anonymous transfer. The facility director called to confirm and to inform you that your mother has been moved to the East Wing, which apparently has a higher staff ratio, and," Vera checked her notes, "a garden access." Mirelle kept staring at the paper. "Ms. Ashcroft." "I heard you. Are you all right?" She was not all right. She was the opposite of all right in a way she couldn't have defined precisely. Because what was happening inside her chest was not grief, and it was not gratitude, and it was not the clean, manageable feeling of relief. It was something far more complicated, something that felt like the ground shifting under her feet in a direction she hadn't chosen and couldn't correct for. She folded the paper in half, then in half again. "Thank you, Vera," she said. She went back to work. Because that was what you did. You went back to work and you processed things in the hours when your hands were occupied, and you did not make decisions about feelings while you were still inside the feeling. She found Cassian in the East Corridor 2 hours later. She didn't go looking for him. She'd decided firmly not to go looking for him. But Blackwater Manor was only so large, and his path and hers intersected at the second-floor landing with the particular inevitability of 2 objects in a closed space. She stopped walking. He stopped walking. "You paid my mother's debt," she said. "The agency handles discretionary—" Don't." She held his gaze. "Don't tell me the agency did it. I know what the agency's budget looks like. I've seen the expense reports." He held her gaze back. He didn't offer her a comfortable lie. "Yes," he said. "Without telling me." "Yes." "Without asking me." A small pause. "Would you have said yes?" She opened her mouth, closed. He already knew the answer. They both did. She would have said no. Not because she didn't need it, not because her pride was worth more than her mother's comfort, but because accepting that kind of thing from a man like him meant something she hadn't been ready to accept. "You should have asked," she said finally. "You're right," he said. Simple, no qualification. She stood there in the upstairs corridor holding herself very still, because the alternative was showing him something she hadn't decided to show anyone, and that wasn't happening in a hallway. "I don't know what to do with this," she said honestly. "You don't have to do anything with it. You spent an enormous amount of money on my family. I spent money I have on something that mattered." He said it without drama, without the performance of generosity that men usually put on when they wanted credit for what they'd given. "Your mother is in a better place. That's the whole of it." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll pay it back," she said. "You won't." "I will." "Mirelle." Again, the weight of her name in his mouth. "You won't." She walked away before she said something she couldn't take back. She spent the rest of the day working with the focused energy of someone channeling something they refused to sit with, and by evening she'd cleaned 3 rooms that weren't on her list and reorganized the entire upstairs linen supply in a way that would have taken Vera a week to undo. That night she called the facility. She spoke to the floor director, who told her about the garden, told her about the room, told her her mother had eaten a full dinner for the first time in 3 weeks, and had spent an hour that afternoon sorting colored scarves with an aide who apparently had the patience of someone who understood exactly what that hour cost and gave it freely. Mirelle sat on the edge of her bed afterward and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and breathed. "Be careful," Marco had said. She understood now what he meant, and she understood why he'd bothered saying it, and she understood that understanding it wasn't the same as being able to do anything about it. The Whitmore Foundation dinner was at a hotel in the city, 45 minutes from Blackwater Manor, the kind of event where the chandeliers cost more than most people's mortgages, and the charity portion was exactly calibrated to make everyone feel good without costing anyone anything real. Mirelle had been to buildings like this. She'd cleaned them. She'd watched women in dresses like the one now hanging in her wardrobe move through rooms like this with the unconscious ease of people who'd grown up knowing they belonged there. She had never moved through one of those rooms as a person with a seat at the table. She told herself it didn't matter. She got dressed. She stood in front of the mirror for exactly 30 seconds. Enough to confirm the dress did what it was supposed to do, which was make her look like she'd chosen to be there, which was its own kind of armor. And then she went downstairs. Cassian was waiting in the entry hall. He looked at her, not the way men usually looked at her. The quick assessment, the categorization, the decision made in under 2 seconds about what kind of attention she warranted. He looked at her the way you look at something that surprised you, and you're not trying to hide the surprise. "You look," he started. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. He closed his mouth. "I look like myself," she said. "That's all." "Yes," he said. And somehow the way he said it was more than what he'd been about to say. The car ride was mostly quiet. Marco sat in front. A second car followed. Through the window, the city moved past in the particular blur of November evening, lights and movement and the specific loneliness of a place that held millions of people who mostly didn't know each other. "Are you nervous?" Cassian asked at some point. "No." She looked out the window. "I'm prepared. Those are different things." "What's the difference?" She thought about it. Nervous is about what might happen. Prepared is about what to do when it does. Another small silence. "You learned that cleaning houses," he said. "I learned at cleaning houses where things went wrong in ways the owners didn't expect, and I was the only one who stayed calm enough to deal with them." She paused. The kind of calm that looks like confidence from the outside is usually just practice from the inside. "And what are you practicing right now?" She looked at him. "Not letting this room define me before I walk into it." He held her gaze in the moving dark of the car. "It won't," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm the one doing the not letting." The dinner was everything she'd expected and nothing she'd felt before. She knew how to navigate a room. She knew how to read who mattered and who wanted to seem like they mattered, and how that difference showed up in the way people held their wine glasses, and whether they checked the door when someone new arrived. She'd spent years invisible in rooms exactly like this, which meant she knew its geography better than half the people currently standing in it. What was different was that she was standing in it with someone, and that someone walked beside her with the particular authority of a man who owned whatever room he entered, and that authority moved through the space around them both. And people looked at her, actually looked, the full-face acknowledgement of someone who existed and counted, because of the man beside her. She held that thought like a stone, turned it over, examined the edge of it. She was being seen because of him. That was true. She was also wearing a dress cut to her actual body, standing with her shoulders back and her chin level, and not one part of her was apologizing for the space she took up. Both things were true. She was still working out what to do with that when she felt the shift in the room. It was subtle, the kind of thing you only caught if you'd spent years reading the temperature of rooms. A ripple of attention moving through the crowd near the far entrance. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind. The kind that meant something with weight had just entered. Dario Bellucci arrived with his usual 6 men and his usual expression. He moved through the room the same way he'd moved through Cassian's dining hall, with the confidence of someone who had never needed to earn the space he occupied. He had the kind of face that age had made harder rather than softer, and his eyes moved over the room with the quick, acquisitive scan of someone perpetually cataloging what was his. His eyes found Mirelle. For 1 second, just one, something moved through his expression. Not shame, not quite. The specific irritation of a man who remembered something unpleasant and resented being reminded. Then his face went neutral, and he looked away. Cassian didn't look at Dario. He was talking to a silver-haired man in a banker's suit about something involving port logistics, and his attention was completely, professionally focused on that conversation. But Mirelle felt the slight change in his posture. Nothing visible, nothing anyone else would have caught. The particular tension of a man who knows exactly where someone is in a room without looking at them. The dinner passed. Speeches were given, money was pledged. The machinery of philanthropy performed itself with the smooth efficiency of people who'd done this before and would do it again, and somewhere in the middle of it, Mirelle found herself at a small table near the windows, talking to a woman named Helen, who turned out to manage a network of domestic staffing agencies and was deeply, genuinely interested in labor practices and supply chain ethics in domestic work. And for 23 minutes, Mirelle was simply a person having a conversation that mattered. It was the best 23 minutes of the evening. She was on her way back from the restroom, navigating the outer corridor where the crowd had thinned, when she heard the voices behind the service door. She was 3 steps past it before her brain caught up with what her ears had already understood. 2 voices. One she didn't recognize. One she did. Lower, rougher, the particular gravel of a man who'd smoked for 30 years and quit too late to undo the damage. Marco. She stopped walking. The door was not fully closed. Through the gap she could hear clearly enough. Timeline moved up, the unfamiliar voice said. The family wants confirmation before end of week. I told you, it's not possible before. Bellucci's people are already pulling out of the Eastern contracts. They know something's coming. If your man doesn't move in the next 48 hours, the window closes and 3 families lose everything they've been building for 2 years. You understand what happens then? A silence. And the woman? Marco's voice. Mirelle went very still. What about her? She's a liability. She's heard things. She knows the layout of the property. She has no loyalty ties to the organization. He won't touch her. He won't have to. The other voice was careful, specific. The voice of someone who had thought this through in advance. Once Bellucci's handled and the war starts in earnest, accidents happen. People in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nobody has to order anything. A pause. The boss doesn't know you're talking to me, Marco said. It wasn't a question. The boss is compromised, the voice said, flat and certain. That's the problem. The organization can't afford a compromised leader, and everyone with eyes can see what's happening. She's been here 6 weeks, and he's already… A pause, a different quality of silence. He paid her mother's medical bills, Marco, out of his own accounts. Another silence. I know, Marco said. Then you know this can't continue. Mirelle became aware, with the specific precision of extreme calm, that she was standing absolutely motionless in a corridor with her hand 6 inches from a half-open door, and that if either voice inside moved toward that door, she had approximately 3 seconds to decide what to do. She moved. Not fast. Fast was noise. She moved the way she'd moved through houses for 12 years, weight forward, heels barely touching, the particular glide of someone who'd learned to cross a room without announcing herself. She was around the corner and into the crowd before the door had shifted an inch. She stood in the middle of a room full of people in evening wear and breathed through her nose, slow and measured, and thought, all right, think. Marco. Marco, who had sat across from her in the kitchen and told her to be careful with Cassian. Marco, who had worked for him for 9 years. Marco, who had the tight-wound energy of someone who'd always had to be faster than the people around him. She found Cassian near the bar. She came up beside him and she said very quietly, I need to talk to you. He looked at her. One look was all it took. Something in her face, some configuration of her features that she couldn't control. And his entire manner changed without visibly changing. His attention sharpened. How long? He said, equally quiet. Now, she said. Not here. Now. He excused himself from the conversation with 3 words she didn't hear and steered her toward the outer corridor with a hand at the small of her back that wasn't possessive and wasn't casual and was exactly as precise as everything else about him. In the car, with Marco in the front seat, she said nothing. She looked at the back of Marco's head and she thought about the voice in the corridor. He paid her mother's medical bills out of his own accounts. And she understood with the cold clarity of exhaustion and shock that she was currently sitting 4 feet from a man who had just agreed, by silence if not by word, to let something happen to her. She kept her face neutral. She was very good at keeping her face neutral. Cassian glanced at her once, from the seat beside her. She didn't look at him. She looked out the window and she breathed, and she took the information she'd gathered and she held it carefully. This is what I heard. This is what it means. This is what I have to decide. The way she'd always held the things that required precision, without panic, without performance, with the steady hands that had never failed her yet. When they reached Blackwater Manor and the car stopped and Marco went ahead through the front entrance, she said to Cassian quietly, "Send him out of the house." Cassian looked at her. "Tonight," she said. "Some errand, some reason. Get him out of the building." His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Tell me what you heard." She told him. She told him everything. Every word she'd caught through the service door gap, every inflection, the specific phrasing that had made her certain she'd understood correctly. She told him cleanly and sequentially without editorializing, because editorializing was what you did when you were afraid the facts alone wouldn't be enough, and the facts alone were devastating. When she finished, Cassian was looking at the floor of the car. He stayed like that for a long moment, long enough that she counted her own heartbeats, long enough that she understood this was not a man who'd been surprised. This was a man who'd been handed a confirmation he'd been carrying the dread of for a while. "How long have you suspected?" she asked. His jaw moved. "Long enough that I should have moved faster." "Did you not move because of me?" The question came out before she'd decided to ask it. He looked up at her. "No," he said, and then, quieter. "Partly." She sat with that for a moment. "What happens now?" she asked. He opened the car door. "Now," he said, "I deal with it." She caught his arm. She didn't plan to. Her hand simply moved and caught his forearm where the sleeve was rolled back, and she felt the tension in his arm like a current. "Don't make it worse trying to make it fast," she said. He looked at her hand on his arm. "I know what I'm doing," he said. "You know what you're angry doing," she said. "That's different." He held still for one long second. She felt something move through the tension in his arm, not releasing, but acknowledging. "Go inside," he said. "Stay in your room." Cassian? Mirelle. Her name in his mouth, and the weight of it, and this time underneath it something she hadn't heard before. "Please." She went inside. She sat in her room with the light off and the window cracked, and she listened to the house below her with every instinct she had, cataloging sounds the way she'd cataloged everything, the movement of feet on stone, the low registers of voices, the specific quality of a silence that meant something had changed. An hour passed, maybe more. Then she heard it, not from below, but from the east wing, a single, muffled impact, the sound of something ending. She pressed her hand against the window glass and breathed. She didn't know what she'd expected to feel. She wasn't sure the word for what she actually felt existed in any language she knew. It wasn't relief, and it wasn't horror, and it wasn't the clean, final sensation of something being resolved. It was the particular weight of understanding that she was in a story, now that had no safe edges, no clean exits, no version of events in which she walked away unchanged. The door to her room opened, not roughly, not with violence. It opened the way Cassian did everything, with the certainty that the space was his to enter and the awareness that she was in it. He stood in the doorway. His jacket was gone. His shirt was... She noted this with the careful, full precision of someone gathering information. Still clean. He had not done it himself then, or he had been careful. She filed it away. "It's handled," he said. She looked at him from across the dark room. "Marco?" He said nothing, which was its own answer. She felt something heavy move through her chest. She'd been prepared for it. She'd heard the confirmation in the corridor. She'd understood what it meant. She'd told Cassian herself. But preparation was not the same as readiness, and she wasn't ready for the specific weight of knowing that a man who'd sat across from her in the kitchen drinking coffee was simply gone. Whatever his reasons, whatever his reasoning, gone. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked at her. "He was with me for 9 years," Cassian said. And the flatness in his voice was not absence of feeling. It was what feeling looked like after a very long time of not having anywhere safe to put it. She got up from the edge of the bed. She crossed the room. She did not touch him. She stood close enough that he could feel her presence in the dark, and she said, "Sit down." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat on the chair by the window, and she sat on the end of the bed, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest, which was close enough. She didn't know when she fell asleep. She woke up to gray light and an empty chair, and a blanket across her shoulders that she definitely hadn't put there herself, and the particular sensation of having slept deeper and more soundly than she had any right to given what had happened the night before. She lay still for a moment. Then she heard it, distant, from below, from the direction of the main gate, the rapid staccato sound of what she knew, now, to identify correctly. Gunfire. She was on her feet before the thought completed. She was at the window before the second burst. Below, through the pre-dawn gray, the grounds of Blackwater Manor were not quiet. She could see movement, not the organized movement of the guards' normal rotation, but the frantic, purposeful movement of men responding to something that had already started. Lights she'd never seen activated were flooding the outer perimeter. Someone was shouting orders she couldn't fully make out, and from the direction of the east wing where Cassian's private rooms were, she heard a sound she'd heard once before in this house, and once before in her life, and that she would have known anywhere. A single gunshot, close. Then silence. Then voices, urgent, low, and the sound of something heavy being moved across stone. Mirelle stood at the window in her dress from the night before, bare feet on the cold floor, and she understood all at once, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd just had the last piece of the night fall into place, that what Marco had described in that corridor, accidents happen, wrong place at wrong time, had not been future planning. It had been a schedule. The betrayal wasn't just Marco. Marco had been the inside piece of something larger, something that had been moving toward this house and this night for longer than anyone had admitted. And the moment Cassian had closed that thread, the rest of the rope had begun to pull. She heard footsteps in the corridor outside her door, rapid, purposeful, and then a fist hit the door hard. "Ms. Ashcroft." Reyes. His voice had the clipped, stripped quality of someone in an operational situation. "We need to move you, now." "Is he alive?" she said through the door, or a beat. "We need to move you right now." She grabbed her shoes. She grabbed nothing else. She opened the door onto a corridor that was suddenly full of men she recognized and men she didn't, moving with the contained urgency of people responding to something that had already gone wrong and wasn't done going wrong yet. And Reyes took her arm and moved her forward with a firm efficiency that she didn't resist because resistance right now was exactly the wrong use of her energy. "Where is he?" she said, moving. "He's being handled." "That's not what I asked." Reyes didn't answer. She let him move her down the corridor, and she cataloged everything she passed. The men at the East Wing entrance, the particular way the door to Cassian's private study was standing open when it never stood open, the dark smear on the door frame that she didn't look at directly but noted. And she filed it all away with the steady, grinding efficiency of someone who had learned that the only way to stay useful in a crisis was to stay observant. They moved her to the interior of the house, a room she'd cleaned twice, a room with no exterior windows, a room that had always seemed slightly too well reinforced for what it officially was. Reyes pushed the door open and she went in. And there was Cassian. He was sitting in the single chair in the room, and he was alive, and he was conscious, and the left side of his shirt was soaked through with the dark, specific red of something that should have stayed inside a body and hadn't. She was across the room before she'd decided to move. "Who's called the doctor?" she said. "Called." Reyes from the doorway. "How long?" 20 minutes out. She was already on her knees beside the chair, already looking, already assessing. Because this was what you did when you had steady hands and a crisis in front of you and a man who was going to bleed out if 20 minutes was actually 20 minutes and not 30. "Stop," Cassian said. I'm not going to stop. "Mirelle, I need something to apply pressure with. she said to Reyes without looking up. Clean, not sterile, will take clean. A shirt, a towel, anything that isn't decorative. Then to Cassian, with her hands already moving, tell me if this is the only wound. He looked at her. His face had the particular quality of a man who had been through pain before and had made a specific peace with it, but she could see beneath that the effort it was costing him to hold that expression, the slight catch in his breathing, the pallor under his complexion that told her his body was working hard at something it was going to lose if she didn't help it. It's the only wound, he said. Is it through? A pause. Yes. That was better than not through. She let herself note that without showing it. Reyes returned with a folded shirt. She took it without looking, pressing it firm and direct against the entry point, watching Cassian's jaw tighten at the pressure. Hold this, she told him. Both hands, firmly. Don't let up. He put his hands over hers, and their fingers overlapped on the cloth, and she felt his pulse through her palms. Too fast, too light. The specific rhythm of a body that was compensating and doing it hard. And she thought, the doctor has to be faster than 20 minutes. How did this happen? She said. Flat. Not asking, really, processing. The same way everything happens, he said, through carefully managed breathing. Someone miscalculated. This time it was me. She looked up at him. His eyes were on her face. Not on the wound, not on the door. On her face, with the focused, deliberate attention of a man choosing where to look when the options aren't good. Don't do that, she said. Do what? Make it philosophical. You're bleeding. She adjusted the pressure. Stay with me, he said very quietly. I'm trying. And the house shook as something exploded against the outer wall, and the lights went out, and Mirelle pressed both hands harder against the wound and did not move. And in the total darkness of a room inside a house that was under siege, she understood that she had passed every threshold she was ever going to be able to pass, and that the woman who had arrived at Blackwater Manor with a laminated list of rules and a talent for being overlooked was simply, completely, and permanently gone. The explosion took out the east wall of the outer gate. Mirelle felt it in her sternum before she heard it, a concussive pressure that moved through the stone floor and up through her knees where she was kneeling and into her chest like a fist. The room shuddered. Dust came down from the ceiling in a thin curtain. Somewhere in the dark, glass broke. She didn't move her hands. Count, Cassian said. What? Count the shots. Tell me what you hear. She listened. Through the ringing that the explosion had left in her ears, through the shouting that was moving through the house in waves, she listened the way she'd learned to listen in rooms where listening was the only useful thing she could do. Automatic fire. East side. 2 positions, maybe 3. She paused. Handguns closer. Inside the perimeter already. His eyes were on her face in the dark. She could feel his attention even without seeing it clearly. How many total? I can't tell. A lot. Estimate. 20. Maybe more. He made a sound she couldn't interpret. Not pain exactly. The sound of a man doing math in his head that wasn't coming out in his favor. Reyes. His voice carried across the room without raising. Reyes was at the door, barely visible, a shape in the dark. Status. East gate is breached. Santos has the front corridor. We've got 12 inside the property, maybe 8 more coming through the wall. Reyes's voice was flat and professional in the way that men's voices went flat when they needed to be flat. We're outnumbered. How bad? Bad. Cassian shifted. Mirelle pressed harder. Don't, she said. You need to sit still or you're going to bleed through this before the doctor gets here. The doctor isn't coming through that gate tonight. She hadn't let herself think about that yet. She thought about it now, quickly, and set it aside. Then we keep pressure until someone else gets here. Mirelle. His hand came over hers on the cloth. She could feel the tremor in it, small, controlled, the tremor of someone managing pain through will and not winning as cleanly as they'd like. Listen to me. I'm listening. There are tunnels. She went still. Old ones. Servant passages, behind the walls. He was watching her face. You've been cleaning this house for 6 weeks. Have you found them? The question landed in her chest like a key turning. She had. She hadn't told anyone. Not because she was planning anything with them. She hadn't been planning anything. She'd simply found them the way she found everything in a house. through the methodical attention of someone responsible for every corner of it. A panel in the east corridor that sat slightly proud of the wall. A hinge behind the linen shelves on the second floor. A door in the basement that wasn't on any blueprint she'd seen but smelled of old wood and cold salt air. "Yes," she said. Something shifted in his expression. "Can you get us through them?" "Depends where we need to come out." "Behind the northwest wall. There's a structure. Looks like a groundskeeper's storage unit from outside. It's not." He paused, breathed carefully. "If we can get 8 men behind their position and hit them from 2 directions simultaneously, this ends tonight." She looked at him. "You're shot," she said. "I know. You can't fight." "I won't have to." The certainty in his voice was not bravado. It was the specific, exhausted certainty of a man who had been in enough situations like this to know the difference between a fight he needed to win himself and one he needed to direct. "I need to be present. I need my men to see me present. That's different." "That's still insane." "Yes." A pause. "Will you do it?" She looked at him. She thought about the passage behind the east linen shelves, the way it branched at the second junction, right toward the old kitchen, left toward what she'd thought was a dead end, but had felt like a door when she pressed against it. The slight downward grade that suggested it ran below the foundation. The smell of ocean air that meant it opened somewhere near the cliffside. She thought, "I am a 34-year-old woman who came here to clean floors." She thought, "That is not what I am anymore." "I need a light," she said, "and I need someone who knows which men to bring." Reyes pulled a flashlight from somewhere on his person and crossed the room in 4 steps. "I know which men." "How many can we move quietly?" 8, maybe 9. 8, she said. "I can't manage 9 in the dark in a narrow passage without noise." Reyes looked at Cassian. Cassian looked at Mirelle. 8, he said. She helped Cassian to his feet with Reyes on the other side, and the sound he made when he stood, brief, involuntary, immediately suppressed, told her more clearly than anything else how much the next hour was going to cost him. She handed him the folded cloth. "Keep the pressure." He took it. His hand was steadier than she'd expected. "Lead," he said to her. She led. The panel in the east corridor was behind a painting she'd removed to clean the wall behind it 4 weeks ago and noted, at the time, that the wall behind it sounded different when she rapped her knuckles against it. Different in the specific way of a wall that wasn't solid behind the surface. She'd filed it away under things that are not my business and moved on. She found it in the dark by counting steps from the staircase. 14 steps, right wall, painting of a ship in a storm. She found the edge of the panel by feel, found the release mechanism. A pressure point at waist height, not a handle, the kind of thing you'd never find if you weren't looking for it, and pushed. The panel opened inward. Cold air. The smell of stone and old wood and salt. The dark beyond the flashlight beam was absolute. She went in first. Behind her, Cassian, one hand on the wall, one pressing the cloth against his side. Then Reyes. Then 7 other men she'd seen in the corridors of this house for 6 weeks without knowing their names, following a housekeeper into a wall. The passage was narrow, shoulder width in places, less in others. The ceiling was low enough that the taller men had to angle their heads, and the floor was uneven stone that required constant attention or it would send you down. She moved by flashlight and by the memory of her hands, which had a different relationship to spaces than her eyes did. 12 years of cleaning in the dark while families slept had given her a spatial memory that operated below the level of thought. At the first junction, she stopped. Left was the direction she'd come from. Right was the direction she'd thought was a dead end. She turned right. Behind her, she heard Cassian's breathing. Controlled, deliberate, the specific rhythm of someone managing pain through technique. She did not look back. Looking back would slow both of them down and would not help anything. The dead end was not a dead end. It was a door, as she'd suspected, and it had a latch on the inside that had been closed for long enough that her first attempt to move it produced nothing, and her second attempt produced a sound like something tearing. "Problem?" Reyes behind her. "No." She reset her grip, used both hands, body weight, the specific torque of someone who'd opened enough seized mechanisms to know that force alone wasn't it, that what you needed was the right angle. She felt it give, then give more. Then the door moved. Cold air hit them like a wall. Outside. And they were outside. They were below the main foundation. The ocean was audible and close. The night was loud in ways the sealed passage had been quiet. Gunfire from above, from the direction of the main house. Shouting. The particular sound of something on fire. She stepped out and pressed herself flat against the stone and looked. They were at the base of the cliffside, a service level she hadn't known existed. Above and to the right, the lights of the manor grounds. Some of them emergency illumination, red-tinted, the kind that made everything look like it was already burning. The northwest wall was 30 yards ahead, and beyond it she could see shapes, movement, the particular movement of men deployed in cover positions facing the wrong direction. Facing the house. Not facing behind them. She turned to Cassian. He was upright. He was pale in the red-tinged dark, and his jaw was set in a way that looked permanent, like it had been set that way for years, and this was simply the night it showed. But he was upright, and his eyes were clear, and he was looking at the northwest wall with the expression of a man doing rapid, precise calculations. 2 positions, he said low. The boulder on the left, and the maintenance structure on the right. I count 4 at the boulder, 2 at the structure. Reyes. When we hit behind, they'll turn. Cassian shifted his weight, and she saw the effort that took, saw the way his left hand pressed harder against his side. Don't give them time to regroup. Hit both simultaneously, and don't stop moving. He looked at his men. They were looking back at him the way men look at someone they've followed into things that had no guaranteed exit, not with fear, exactly. With the focused, stripped-back attention of people who'd decided in advance that this was the person they were trusting, and they were going to trust him all the way. You stay here, Cassian said to Mirelle. I got you here, she said. Yes. Now stay here. What if there are more in the passage? What if someone comes from the house side while I'm standing? Reyes, Cassian without looking away from her. Ma'am, Reyes said. There's a position against that wall where you'll have sight lines both directions. He pointed. 12 feet. Nothing approaches without you seeing it first. She looked at Cassian. He looked back at her with an expression she'd seen on him before, the one that wasn't quite a request and wasn't quite an order, and occupied the specific territory between them that had always been theirs. She went to the wall. She pressed her back against the stone, 12 feet from the passage door, sight lines in both directions, and she watched Cassian and 8 men move through the dark in 2 groups toward positions that the men at the northwest wall couldn't see. Her heartbeat was very loud in her ears. She made herself breathe. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. The thing about staying calm wasn't that you felt calm. It was that you moved through the not calm in a way that didn't amplify it. In, out. The 2 groups hit simultaneously. It was not elegant. Nothing about it was elegant. Violence never was, regardless of what movies suggested. It was fast and loud and chaotic in the specific way of things that happened faster than anyone's planning could fully account for. She heard it more than she saw it, from her position against the wall. Shouts, impacts, the sharp crack of weapons, the sounds of men fighting in the compressed urgency of people who understood that stopping was not an option. 30 seconds. Maybe 40. She counted without meaning to. Then something she hadn't seen coming. From the passage behind her, the passage she'd just brought them through, she heard movement. She froze. Footsteps. In the passage, moving fast, not carefully, which meant either someone who knew the passage well enough not to need to be careful or someone desperate enough not to care. She had no weapon. She had nothing in her hands. She pressed flat against the stone beside the passage door, and she breathed and she thought, okay, what do you have? She had the flashlight turned off now. Heavy metal casing, standard issue. She had 12 years of staying calm in rooms where other people were panicking. She had the fact that whoever was coming through that passage was going to come through a door that opened inward, which meant they were going to be slightly off balance for exactly 1 second when they came through it. She waited. The door opened. She swung. The flashlight connected with something solid, a shoulder, she thought, not the head she'd aimed for because he'd come through ducking. And the man came through the door and stumbled, and she moved away from the wall, putting distance between them, because distance was what she had, and she needed to keep it. He was big, bigger than her. He recovered faster than she'd hoped, but she'd bought herself 4 feet in a second, and she used the second to scream, not in fear, in volume, as loud as she could manage, the pure functional sound of someone who needed someone else's attention immediately. She heard Reyes shout something. The man came at her and she moved sideways and he caught her arm and swung her into the wall, and the impact sent a white flash across her vision, and her knees tried to quit on her, but she grabbed the passage door frame with her free hand and held. And she thought through the white in her vision. Don't go down. Going down ends this. She didn't go down. She heard running. Fast. Close. And then Reyes was there, and it was over in a duration she couldn't accurately measure, and she was standing against the wall with her shoulder throbbing and her vision clearing and her breathing very loud in her own ears. "You good?" Reyes said. "Fine." She wasn't fine. "How many more in the passage?" "Checking." "Don't check. Block it. Someone goes back in, blocks the door from this side." She pushed off the wall. Her shoulder screamed. She ignored it. "Where is he?" Reyes didn't have to ask who she meant. He pointed. Cassian was at the northwest wall, standing among men who were alive and men who weren't, and he was on his feet, which was the first thing she established. And he was still pressing his left hand against his side, which told her everything about what that was costing him. And he was talking, low, rapid, to two of his men, who were listening with the focused attention of people receiving instructions. She crossed the distance between them. He heard her coming and turned, and the look on his face when he confirmed she was upright and intact was brief and unguarded and more honest than anything she'd seen on him in 6 weeks. "The passage," she said. "Handled?" "One came through. Reyes blocked it." "How many more?" "I don't know. Could be none. Could be more." He turned back to his men. "Seal it. Both ends." Then to her, quietly. "You're hurt." "Shoulder. I'm fine." "You're not fine." "I'm functional. That's enough." She looked at his side. Even in the red-tinted dark, she could see the cloth was darker than it had been. "You're still bleeding." "I know." "Cassian, I know." He held her gaze. "Almost done." "Almost done isn't done." "No," he said. "But look." He tilted his head toward the manor. She looked. The gunfire had stopped. Not paused. Stopped. The specific quality of a sound's absence that meant it had ended, not merely interrupted. From the direction of the front of the house, she could hear voices. Her ears were good enough now, adrenaline sharpening everything to an almost unbearable clarity. And the voices were Cassian's men's voices, calling status checks to each other, which was not the sound of a fight still happening. It was the sound of a fight being assessed after. "Is it?" she started. "Not yet," he said. "There's one more thing." As if the words had been a cue, she heard it, from inside the house, through the shattered east wall, through the rooms she'd spent 6 weeks cleaning with the specific intimacy of someone responsible for every surface. She heard Dario Bellucci's voice, loud and jagged, with the particular quality of a man who understood he was out of options and was making noise instead of accepting it. Mirelle. The name carried across the broken grounds like something thrown. "He's inside," Reyes said. Not alarmed. Informational. "How many with him?" "When we hit the northwest position, his main force was there." Reyes checked something in his earpiece. 2. Maybe 3. Cassian's jaw tightened. He straightened, fully, deliberately, at a cost she could see in every line of his body. And he looked at the shattered east wall of the manor. "Don't," she said. "It has to end." "Then send Reyes." "He'll only come out for me." Cassian looked at her. "He's here because of me. The contract, the war, all of it. It ends when I'm the one standing in front of him." He paused. "You know I'm right." She did know. She hated that she knew. "You're shot," she said for the 3rd time, because she didn't have anything more effective to say. "Yes." He checked the weapon Reyes had put in his hand at some point in the last 60 seconds, the specific practiced motion of someone for whom that check was as automatic as breathing. "Stay behind Reyes." "Cassian, behind Reyes." His voice was steady, quiet. The voice he used when things were serious enough that performance would be an insult to the moment. "Please." She looked at him. She thought about the kitchen in the early morning and the way he'd listened to her talk about her mother's hands. She thought about the torn-up resignation letter on the entryway table. She thought about the voice in the corridor. He paid her mother's medical bills out of his own accounts. and the particular violence of being seen by someone you hadn't planned to let see you. Behind Reyes, she said. 2 steps. 1 step behind Reyes and 5 behind me. 2 behind Reyes. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile and was not quite fear and occupied the particular territory that had always been his. Fine, he said. They went inside. The grand foyer of Blackwater Manor was a ruin. She'd polished these floors. She'd run a cloth along the balustrade of that staircase. She'd cleaned the chandelier glass by glass with a specialized solution and a very small brush. She'd learned the specific pitch of the floor near the east window that caught dust along a seam in the stone and needed daily attention. She knew this room the way you know the rooms you've been responsible for, intimately, practically, with the specific knowledge of someone who's seen it at every hour and in every light. It looked like something had decided to end it, glass everywhere. The chandelier had come down. Not in the explosion, she thought. Something else, something more deliberate. And it lay across the floor in a cascade of crystal and bent metal. The marble was scored and cracked in the places where the fighting had moved through. 2 of Cassian's men were down along the east wall. Others were at positions she recognized as defensible, the archway to the corridor, the base of the staircase, and between them and the entrance, in the center of the wrecked foyer, stood Dario Bellucci. He had 2 men flanking him. He had a gun in his hand. He looked like a man who'd run out of road and hadn't entirely finished understanding that yet. And he had Mirelle in his eye line the moment she came through the door. "There she is," he said. His voice had changed from the dining room. Smoother then, performing for an audience. Now it had the stripped quality of someone who'd dropped the performance because the audience was gone. "The little housekeeper." "It's over, Dario." Cassian's voice from 3 steps ahead of her. Calm. The specific calm of something that had moved past the need to perform itself. "Your people outside are finished." "My people outside," Dario said almost conversationally, were a distraction. His eyes moved to Mirelle, stayed there. The point was always to come inside. She felt Reyes shift beside her. "The point," Cassian said, "was to make me react. You wanted me outside with my people so someone could come through the passage and—" He stopped. She saw it land on him. She saw the specific moment of a man realizing that the thing he'd been told was an opportunistic breach of the passage was not opportunistic at all. That the man who'd come through the passage had not been following them. He'd been going ahead of where he knew they'd end up. "He wasn't after me," Cassian said. Very quiet. "No," Dario said, and he raised the gun and he aimed it at Mirelle, and he said, "She's your weakness. Everyone in 3 families knows it. I know it. And weaknesses don't survive wars." The room became very small. She was aware of specific things with extreme clarity, the weight of Reyes beside her, half a step forward, already moving to put himself between her and the gun. The sound of Cassian's breathing, 12 feet ahead, which had changed in a way she couldn't define but recognized as something she'd never heard from him before. The cold air moving through the broken east wall across the back of her neck. The crystal from the chandelier under her feet, making the floor a problem if anyone needed to move fast. She was aware that Dario's hands were steady. She was aware that the distance between the barrel of that gun and her chest was a distance that didn't leave room for the kind of errors that people survived. She was aware that Cassian was moving, not toward Reyes, not toward cover, toward Dario, in the specific, deliberate way he moved through every room, with the absolute certainty that nothing in the space was going to require him to change course. "Cassian," she said. He didn't stop. Dario's gun moved from her to Cassian, back to her. The calculation in his eyes was rapid and visible, the specific calculus of a man deciding which target mattered more. She made the decision for him. She moved left, directly left, hard, putting herself behind the bulk of the downed chandelier, the only cover available, forcing Dario's gun to follow her or abandon its line on Cassian, and she heard the shot. She heard it the way you hear things when your body has gone past fear into something older and more functional, and felt the crystal explode near her left hand where the bullet hit the metal of the chandelier frame. Too close. But not her. In the half-second that Dario's attention had followed her, Cassian had crossed the remaining distance. 1 shot. 1. The sound of it in the stone foyer was enormous, and then it was gone. And the only sounds left were the settling of debris and the breathing of the people still standing and the distant, steady sound of the Atlantic below the cliffs, indifferent and permanent as it had always been. Dario Bellucci hit the marble floor of the grand foyer and did not get up. His two men looked at each other. They looked at Cassian. They put their weapons on the floor. Mirelle was kneeling behind the chandelier, her left hand bleeding from a cut she hadn't felt happen, her right hand braced on the cold marble, and she was looking at Cassian across the ruined foyer. I was standing. He was still standing, which was the thing she hadn't been sure of, which was the thing that everything in her chest reorganized itself around. But his left hand had dropped from his side, and the color of his shirt in the emergency lighting was very dark, and when he turned toward her, his movement had the particular quality of something that had been running on will for longer than the body could sustain and was now presenting the bill. Cassian. She was on her feet. She didn't remember standing. Stay upright. Stay. He went to one knee. She crossed the foyer at a pace that wasn't running and wasn't walking, but was the fastest she'd moved in her life, crystals shattering under her shoes. And she was beside him before he went to the second knee, and her hands were on him, and she was talking. She could hear herself talking, but she couldn't have said what she was saying because everything in her was occupied with the immediate, practical, desperate task of keeping him from going all the way down on that floor. "I've got you," she said. She could hear that part. "I've got you, don't—" "I'm all right," he said. "You're not all right." "Relatively." "That's not—" She got an arm around him, her shoulder screaming at the weight, and Reyes was there on the other side, and between them they held him. "The doctor," she said to Reyes. "Calling now, 30 minutes. Get a car to the gate. Get someone to bring the car to the gate and drive toward town. Cut the distance." "Yes, ma'am." Cassian made a sound that was, improbably, almost a laugh. "Ma'am," he said. "Don't." She tightened her grip. "Don't do that thing where you're charming when things are bad." "I'm not charming. I'm noting that Reyes has never called anyone ma'am in 9 years. Cassian. Mirelle. Her name in his mouth, and the weight of it, and underneath it now, beneath the exhaustion and the pain and the controlled deliberateness of a man managing the cost of the last several hours, something she'd been hearing for weeks and hadn't let herself name. "You need to stay awake," she said. "I know. Talk to me." "About what?" She looked at the ruined foyer around them, the broken chandelier, the scored marble, the crystal that had been 6 hours ago, something she was responsible for keeping clean. "Tell me something true," she said, "something that isn't in any file." He looked at her. His eyes were clear. She'd been watching for them to lose clarity. That was the sign. That was what you monitored. And they were clear, tired and pained and clear, and in them she saw the specific expression of a man who recognized what she'd just done, giving his own words back to him, and who was too tired and too honest to deflect it. "I knew you were leaving," he said. "That night, the first night, before I came downstairs." He paused, breathed carefully. "I'd been watching the camera feed. I saw you packing. I had—" Another pause. 20 minutes to decide whether to let you go." She looked at him. 20 minutes is a long time," she said. "It wasn't," he said. "It was the fastest 20 minutes of my life." The foyer was quiet around them and outside the manor. The Atlantic moved against the cliffs with the same indifference it had always had, and somewhere in the dark beyond the broken gate the lights of a car were moving toward them, and Mirelle held on to Cassian Virelli. In the wreckage of the house she'd spent 6 weeks learning from the inside out, and she thought, "This is not the life I came here for." And then, with the steady, clear-eyed practicality that had always been the most reliable thing about her, "This is the life that's here." The car arrived at the gate in 19 minutes. Mirelle knew because she counted. Not obsessively, practically, the way she did everything, because knowing the number meant she could manage the interval instead of just surviving it. 19 minutes of keeping Cassian talking, keeping Reyes informed, keeping her hand pressed against his side, while she knelt on the marble of a foyer that 24 hours ago she had been responsible for keeping clean. The doctor's name was Ferraro. She'd seen him once before, the night Cassian had come back from what she'd later understood was a meeting that became something else, moving through the east corridor with a medical bag and the practiced invisibility of someone who'd learned that the work he did in this house required him to see nothing peripheral. He was compact and gray-haired, and he moved the way surgeons moved in her experience of them, with a focused economy that left no room for anything except the problem in front of him. He looked at the wound. He looked at Cassian's face. He looked at Mirelle's hands still pressing the cloth. "How long?" he said. "Since the first shot?" "Nearly 2 hours," she said. "He's been mobile for most of it." Ferraro made a sound that wasn't quite disapproval and wasn't quite surprise. He opened his bag. "I need the room." "I'm staying," Mirelle said. He looked at her, then at her hands, then at whatever was on her face. "Stay out of my way," he said. She stayed. It took 40 minutes. She knew because she counted those too. She stood against the wall near the window of the smaller sitting room they'd moved him to. The same room where she'd had coffee at 4 in the morning, what felt like a different lifetime. And she watched Ferraro work with the focused attention of someone who needed to be useful and had been told the only useful thing was to be still. She looked at Cassian's face when the pain was bad. She watched him manage it, the specific private discipline of a man who'd decided long ago that showing pain was a kind of surrender, and who was losing that particular argument with his own body in small increments that he thought she wasn't tracking. She was tracking all of it. When Ferraro finally straightened and began closing his bag, his face had the expression of a man who'd done something difficult and knew it would hold but wasn't ready to call it certain yet. "He needs to be still for 48 hours, he said. He was talking to Mirelle, not to Cassian, which told her something about what he'd observed in the last 40 minutes. No movement that isn't necessary. Fluids, rest, nothing that elevates the heart rate. He paused. "I'll come back tomorrow evening." He left. Cassian lay on the narrow couch with his eyes half open, the particular stillness of someone whose body had finally stopped accepting orders. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man who was tired all the way down. She brought water. He took it without comment. She pulled the chair from the desk to beside the couch and sat. He looked at her from under heavy eyelids. "You should sleep." "Probably." "Mirelle." "I'll sleep when Ferraro says the wound is stable." She held his gaze. "Don't argue with me about this right now." He didn't argue. They sat in the quiet of the room while the house around them settled into the aftermath of itself. She could hear men moving through corridors, the sound of things being assessed, orders given in low voices, the specific activity of people cleaning up after something violent, which she understood. She had always understood, better than anyone here had initially given her credit for. After a while, Cassian said, "The agency." She looked at him. "I bought it," he said, 3 weeks after you arrived." His voice was slower now than it usually was, the edges of exhaustion softening the deliberateness he normally maintained. "Every employment record connected to your name. Cleared." He paused. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know how to tell you in a way that didn't sound like what it probably looked like." She thought about that. What did it look like? "Like I was eliminating your options." "Were you?" A long pause. The kind where the answer was complicated and he was deciding how much of that to let show. "I was making sure," he said finally, "that if something happened here, anything, there was no paper trail that led back to you, no record of your employment, no reason for anyone to look for you by starting with the agency." He looked at the ceiling. "It was protective. I understand if it didn't feel that way." She sat with that for a moment, turned it over, examined the edge of it the way she'd examined everything he'd given her, for the place where the generosity ended and the control began. Because in her experience, those two things lived close together in men who had a lot of power and had learned to use it like a language. "It felt like both," she said finally. "Yes." He said it without defense. "I know. The mother's debt." "Also both," he said. "You could have asked. You would have said no." "Yes." She looked at her hands on her knees. "So you took the choice away to give me a better outcome. You understand how that sounds?" "I understand exactly how it sounds." His jaw moved. "I've spent a lot of years making decisions for people because I could see the outcome they couldn't. Sometimes that was because I knew more than they did. Sometimes it was because I didn't trust them to choose right." He paused. "With you it was different." "How?" "Because I knew you'd choose right. You always choose right. That's the problem." He turned his head to look at her directly. "If I'd asked, you would have said no because saying yes to me felt like a transaction you didn't want to be in. And you would have been right to feel that. But your mother would still be in a building where nobody knew her name." He held her gaze. I made the call. I'm not going to pretend I regret it. I regret that it cost you something to receive it. She looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to change. Not light yet, not the full arrival of morning, but the preliminary shift in the dark that meant morning was coming whether anyone was ready for it or not. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, she said. I know. I'm going to tell you that I understand the difference between what you did and what people usually do when they take choices away from me. She paused. I'm still working out what to do with that difference. He said nothing. Don't make those kinds of decisions for me again, she said. Ask. Even if you think I'll say no, ask anyway and let me say it, and then we'll figure out what's actually true. He held her gaze. All right. I mean it. I know you mean it. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, something older and less performed than that. That's why I'm agreeing instead of negotiating. She almost laughed. She didn't quite, but almost. She fell asleep in the chair sometime before dawn, sitting upright with her arms crossed and her chin toward her chest, which was not comfortable and would make itself known to her spine within the next several hours. She slept deeply anyway, the way you sleep when the thing you've been holding yourself together for has finally resolved enough to let you down. She woke to gray light and Cassian watching her from the couch, not the assessing, calculating attention he'd trained on her in the library that first morning. Something quieter than that. Something that didn't need to figure anything out. How long was I asleep? She said. 3 hours, maybe? She straightened and her spine made its complaint known immediately. She ignored it. How do you feel? Like I got shot. That's specific? You asked a specific question. She stood and crossed to the couch and checked the dressing the way Ferraro had shown her, because Ferraro would be back that evening, and she would not be handing a man back to his doctor in worse condition than she'd received him. The wound was holding. The color of the dressing was acceptable. His skin was warm, but not the wrong kind of warm. She stood back. Eat something, she said. He looked at her. Are you going to cook? I'm going to find Vera and tell her to cook. I'm not your housekeeper. She paused. Technically, I'm not anyone's housekeeper. Apparently, my employment records don't exist. The look on his face when she said that, the brief, uncertain quality of a man who'd prepared for anger and received something more complicated, was the most unguarded she'd ever seen him. Vera, she said. Food, 45 minutes. She picked up her shoes from where she'd left them at the base of the chair and walked to the door. Mirelle. She stopped. Thank you, he said, for the passage, for... He stopped, started again. For not leaving when it would have been the reasonable thing to do. She looked at him over her shoulder. He looked exhausted and pale and very human in the gray morning light, with none of the armor that rooms full of dangerous men required of him. It stopped being the reasonable thing, she said, some time ago. She found Vera in the kitchen at 6:15, already making coffee with the focused efficiency of a woman who responded to crisis by doing the next useful thing. The kitchen showed signs of the night. A broken window repaired temporarily with cardboard and tape, a crack along the north wall that hadn't been there yesterday, 2 chairs that had been moved to block a door and not yet moved back. Vera looked at Mirelle, assessed her with the complete thoroughness of 10 seconds of eye contact, and said nothing about the cut on her left hand or the bruise that was developing on her shoulder or the state of the dress she'd been wearing for 16 hours. Eggs, Vera said. Please, Mirelle said. And something for him. Whatever Ferraro said was appropriate. I spoke to Ferraro. Vera cracked eggs with the precision of someone who'd been cracking eggs for 60 years and found the task beneath comment. Soft food, nothing with effort, she paused. You stayed with him? Yes. All night? Yes, Vera. Vera cracked another egg. He hasn't had someone stay with him, she said, in the particular tone of a woman making a factual observation that happened to contain a great deal more than its surface. Since his brother died, 7 years ago. She set the bowl aside. I'm not telling you that to make you feel anything. I'm telling you because you should know what you're in the middle of. Mirelle sat down at the kitchen table. I know what I'm in the middle of. Vera looked at her. Do you? I know it's not simple. I know it's not safe. I know there are things about his life that I'm going to have to decide whether I can live alongside. She met Vera's gaze steadily. I know that me being here means something different than me being a housekeeper. And I know that's going to make certain people uncomfortable, and I know I'll be expected to prove something to those people before they accept it. She paused. I know all of that. I've known it for weeks. I've just been deciding whether it was mine to step into or not. Vera looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to the stove. How do you take your eggs? She said. Scrambled, said Mirelle, with whatever's available. Everything's available, Vera said. It always was. The days that followed were not cinematic. That was the thing nobody told you about the aftermath of violence. It was profoundly, exhaustingly administrative. There were men to account for, 2 of them gone, which left Reyes with a particular quietness that wasn't grief exactly, but was the thing grief left behind when there wasn't time to sit with it. There were structural repairs to assess. There were communications to be made with people Mirelle didn't know and wasn't introduced to, calls that happened behind closed doors in Cassian's voice that was gradually regaining its normal weight as the days moved forward and Ferraro's daily visits confirmed the wound was closing the way it should. There were also, less dramatically, 3 bathrooms that nobody had cleaned in 4 days, and a kitchen that needed deep attention, and a linen situation in the guest wing that Mirelle addressed purely because she couldn't walk past it and not address it, and because doing something with her hands while her mind processed the last 2 weeks was how she had always worked. Vera caught her in the upstairs corridor on the 3rd morning with an armload of clean sheets and said, You don't have to do that. I know, Mirelle said. He'll say something if he finds out you've been... He can say something, Mirelle said. I'll hear him out. Then I'll finish the linens. Vera pressed her lips together in the way that meant she was deciding not to argue. It was a look Mirelle had come to recognize and appreciate. There's a meeting this afternoon, Vera said. Representatives from 2 of the other families. He wants you there. Mirelle stopped walking. For what? He didn't say specifically. He said he wanted you present. A pause. He doesn't do things without reason. I know he doesn't. She shifted the sheets. Where? The main study, 4 o'clock. She was there at 4 o'clock. She almost wasn't. She stood outside the study door for 90 seconds, arguing with herself about what it meant to walk into that room and whether she was walking in as a witness, a prop, a presence, or something she didn't have a word for yet. Then she opened the door because 90 seconds was as long as she'd allotted for that particular argument. The room held 6 men she didn't know. And Cassian, who was seated, Ferraro had been clear about standing for extended periods, behind the desk with the particular stillness of someone managing physical discomfort through the discipline of making it invisible. He looked up when she entered. Across the room, 6 men who had been looking at the wall or the table or their own hands all registered her arrival with the specific quality of attention that meant her presence had been anticipated and was being evaluated. She crossed the room and sat in the chair that had been placed, and she noted this, the chair that had been specifically placed, to the left of the desk, slightly behind it, the position of someone present but not performing. She sat. She placed her hands on her knees. She looked at the room with the expression she used when she was in rooms where things were being decided, and her job was to observe and remember, which had always been the expression of someone who knew more than they were showing. The meeting lasted 2 hours. She said almost nothing. She did not need to. She watched the men who represented what remained of the Eastern Alliance, watched them navigate the specific, careful language of people renegotiating terms after a conflict in which they had been on the losing side. She watched the way Cassian moved through the conversation, not dominating it exactly, but orienting it, the way a current orients water without being visible in it. She watched the places where the tension in the room spiked and settled and spiked again, where old resentment surfaced in the phrasing of apparently neutral questions and were answered with the specific precision of someone who'd heard the real question underneath. And she watched the men in the room watch her. Not with hostility, not exactly. With the assessing attention of people recalibrating. Who she was. What her presence here meant. What it would mean going forward. She could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, and she held their attention when it came to her, and she didn't look away. And she did not perform anything. Not deference, not authority, not the particular arrangement of features that women in rooms like this had historically been expected to arrange. She was just there. At one point, a man named Caruso, broad, silver-haired, the kind of physical presence that communicated decades of being the largest thing in every room, looked at her directly and said, "Ms. Ashcroft, you were present for the events of last week." "Yes," she said. "All of them." "Substantially." Caruso looked at Cassian, then back at her. "And your role going forward?" It was not a question. It was an invitation to define herself, which was also a test of whether she'd accept an invitation from a man like Caruso or require something more carefully phrased. She looked at him steadily. "I haven't made any announcements about that," she said. "Neither has anyone else. What I can tell you is that I was in this house during last week's events. I know what happened and why. And I'm still here." She paused one beat. "Draw whatever conclusion seems accurate." Caruso held her gaze. Then something moved across his face. Not approval exactly, but the specific expression of a man revising an assessment upward. And he looked back at Cassian and continued the conversation. After the men left, the study was quiet for a long moment. Cassian looked at her from behind the desk. "Caruso asked about you specifically," he said, "before the meeting." "I assumed. He wanted to know if you were a liability." "What did you tell him?" "I told him you'd answer for yourself." He held her gaze. "I was right." She looked at the empty chairs. "What happens now? With the families?" "The Eastern contracts redistribute. 2 families take smaller shares, the third absorbs the piece Bellucci was skimming. Everyone loses slightly less than they would have if this had gone on another 6 months. He paused. "It's not justice, it's math." "I know the difference," she said. "I know you do." She stood and moved to the window. The grounds outside were being actively repaired. She could see 2 men assessing the gate, another working at the east wall where the explosion had taken out a section of stone. The morning light was different than it had been 2 weeks ago. She wasn't sure if the light had changed or her eyes had. "I need to go see my mother," she said. Silence behind her. "I need to go soon. Tomorrow, if the situation is stable enough." "It's stable," he said. "I need to go alone." She turned. "Not with a car full of men. Not with Reyes. I need to get on a train and go to Queens and sit with my mother in her garden and have it be normal. I need that to still exist." He looked at her. "I understand." "Do you?" "Mirelle." He said her name carefully, the way he always said it, like something with weight. "I'm not going to make you a prisoner here. That was never—" He stopped, pressed his lips together in the way he did when he was choosing his words with more care than usual. "What I want is a great deal more complicated than keeping you here. I know the difference." She looked at him. She crossed the room and stood in front of the desk and looked at him directly, the way she'd looked at Caruso an hour ago, without performance, without the arrangement of features designed to manage someone else's comfort. "I'm going to tell you something true," she said. He waited. "I came to this house to clean floors." She held his gaze. "I was good at it. I was good at it because I'd spent a long time making myself useful in ways that didn't require anyone to see me. And it worked. I was invisible. I was safe. I was—" She paused. "I was half a person, and I'd made a reasonable peace with that." He said nothing. "You broke that," she said. "Not intentionally. I'm not saying you planned any of this. But you looked at me in a room where you weren't supposed to notice I existed, and you kept looking, and that undoes something. That's not a small thing." She felt the truth of it move through her as she said it, the specific weight of a thing you've known for weeks finally being said out loud. "I don't know exactly what this is. I don't know what it becomes. I know that I'm not invisible anymore, and I can't go back to being invisible, and I'm not sure I'd want to." She paused. "I also know you're used to making decisions for the people around you, and I'm not a person that can be decided for. Not anymore. Maybe not ever." Cassian looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said. "You've made that extremely clear. I need you to actually know it, not agree with it right now, and then, Mirelle." He leaned forward slightly against Ferraro's instructions, she was certain, and his eyes on hers were very direct. "I tore up your resignation letter the night you tried to leave. I know what that looked like. I've thought about it every day since." He paused. "I'm not going to do it again, not because I wouldn't want you to stay, because the only version of you staying that means anything is the version where it's your choice." He held her gaze. "Take the train tomorrow. Take it alone. Stay as long as you need to." She looked at him. And if I decide, she said slowly, that I need longer than a day. Something moved through his expression, the briefest, most honest flash of something it would have cost him to show. Then you take longer, he said, and I'll be here. You'd wait. Yes. How long? He held her gaze. As long as it takes. She looked at him for a moment more. Then she straightened and picked up her jacket from the chair. I'll be back the day after tomorrow, she said. She left before she could see his face change, but she heard, in the quiet of the study behind her, the specific sound of a man exhaling. Slow, deliberate, the breath of someone who'd been holding something in for longer than they'd realized. She went to Queen's the next morning. She wore her own clothes. Not the green dress, not the agency uniform, but her own things. The ones she'd packed in the bag that had never made it past the front gate 6 weeks ago. She took a train and then a bus, and then she walked 2 blocks in November air that smelled like the city instead of the ocean, and she pushed open a door into a building that smelled like antiseptic and floor wax, and the particular floral quality of an air freshener trying to be something more pleasant than it was. She found her mother in the garden, not the small concrete space at the old facility, an actual garden with raised beds of winter-hardy plants, and a wooden bench in the weak morning sun, and a young aide sitting nearby with the patient, present attention of someone who was genuinely there and not just physically present. Her mother was wearing a blue cardigan Mirelle had sent 3 months ago and had not expected to see on her because the old facility had a habit of things disappearing. Her mother looked up when Mirelle came through the garden door. There was a moment, the particular devastating moment that Mirelle had learned to absorb without showing on her face, where her mother's expression moved through something that wasn't quite recognition and wasn't quite its absence. The reaching quality of a mind working towards something it couldn't fully close its hand around. And then her mother said, Mirelle. Just that. Her name. Mirelle sat down on the bench beside her and took her mother's hands. The hands she'd described to Cassian in a kitchen at dawn. The hands that still knew what to do even when the rest of it was uncertain. And she held them, and she breathed, and she did not cry. Because crying was for later, for the train home, for the private dark of a moving window, with the city blurring past. I'm here, Mama, she said. Her mother looked at her with the clear, specific attention of a good moment, the kind you learn not to count on, but to be fully present inside when they came. You look different, her mother said. I've been somewhere different. Somewhere good? Mirelle thought about a library with a Persian rug and a shell casing and the smell of copper. She thought about a dining room frozen by silence. She thought about a tunnel in the dark under a stone manor with her hand on a panel and 8 men breathing behind her. She thought about a chair beside a couch and gray morning light, and a man who'd learned somewhere along the way that protecting people and controlling them were not the same thing, and was still learning the difference. Complicated, she said, but yes, somewhere good. Her mother nodded as if this made sense, because to her mother's particular non-linear logic, it probably did. They sat in the garden for 2 hours. They didn't talk the whole time. Sometimes her mother was clear, and sometimes she was somewhere else, and Mirelle stayed for both. Before she left, her mother caught her hand at the garden door. The boy, her mother said. Mirelle looked at her. What boy, Mama? Her mother gave her the look, the slightly impatient look of a woman who had always been sharper than the people around her expected. The one that made you look different. She patted Mirelle's hand once, twice, the particular rhythm of someone making a point through touch instead of words. Is he good to you? Mirelle thought about it. She thought about it honestly, with the same clear-eyed practicality she'd applied to everything in her life that mattered. He's trying to be, she said. That's not the same as being good at it yet. But he's trying. Her mother seemed to consider this. That's more than most, she said, and released her hand. She took the train back in the early evening, the city moving past the window in the blue-gray light of late afternoon in November. She thought about the last 6 weeks with the particular attention she'd always given to things she needed to understand fully, not picking them apart, but turning them in her mind the way you turn something in your hands to find its actual shape. She'd arrived at Blackwater Manor as a woman who had made herself invisible for so long that invisibility had started to feel like identity. She'd been good at it, better than anyone had recognized, which was the whole point of being good at it. She'd cleaned rooms that held evidence of things she'd chosen not to know, and she'd kept her head down and her hands steady, and she'd survived. And then a man had looked at her in a room where she wasn't supposed to exist. And he'd kept looking, and the looking had cost them both something. And the cost hadn't been paid yet. Not fully. Maybe not for a long time. But she was on a train going back. That was the fact of it. She was on a train going back to a house that was still being repaired from the violence that had moved through it. Going back to a man who was still being repaired from the same violence. Going back to a life that was not the life she'd arrived with and couldn't be returned to in any case. She wasn't going back because she'd been left with no options. Her name had been cleared from the agency records, yes. Her old life had been technically dismantled in ways that would take time to rebuild, but she was not a woman without options. She'd never been that woman, even when it had felt that way. She'd always had the option of the next thing, the next job, the next house, the next floor to clean. She was going back because she'd looked at all her options, and this was the one she was choosing. That was different. The difference mattered. Reyes was at the station when she arrived. She saw him before he saw her, standing at the edge of the platform, in the particular way of a man who'd been told not to make it obvious he was there. She walked up beside him and said, "I told him I was coming alone." "You are alone," Reyes said. "I'm just here to tell you the road is icy from the coast turn and the gate's been fixed, functionally." She looked at him. "He didn't send me," Reyes said. Which meant Reyes had come himself, which meant something about the last 6 weeks that she didn't examine too directly. "The gate's fixed," she said. "Mostly." "Mostly," she repeated. "We're working on it." She walked to the car. She got in. Reyes drove without conversation, which she appreciated, and the road was indeed icy from the coast turn, and the gate was indeed mostly fixed. One panel fully restored, one still in scaffolding, and the guards at the entrance nodded when she came through with a specificity that told her the nod meant something different than it had 6 weeks ago. The manor was lit from inside against the dark. She stood at the base of the front steps for a moment. Not long. Just long enough to register what it felt like to stand here voluntarily, having been away and come back, instead of standing here because she hadn't made it past the stairs. She went in. Cassian was in the smaller sitting room, the room where she'd drunk coffee at 4 in the morning, the room that was starting to mean something specific to both of them, she suspected, though neither of them had said so. He was upright, which meant he'd pushed past Ferraro's instructions, which she'd expected. I was at the window when she came in, looking out at the dark grounds and the distant edge of the Atlantic, and he turned when she opened the door. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Icy road," she said. "I know. I should have warned you." Reyes covered it. Something moved across his face at that. Of course he did. She set her bag down by the door. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window. Below, the Atlantic was doing what it always did. Indifferent, constant, without opinion about the people looking at it. She'd spent a lot of time staring at it since she'd arrived at this house. It had been many different things in those weeks. Ominous, beautiful, simply present, a sound to measure silences against. Tonight, it was just water. "She said your name," Mirelle said. "My mother, before I left." She looked at the water. "She called you the boy." She heard the quality of his silence change. "She asked if you were good to me," she said. "What did you tell her?" "That you were trying." She paused. "That it was more than most." He was quiet for a moment, then quietly, "I'll do better than trying." "I know," she said. "That's why I came back." They stood at the window for a while, not speaking, the house settling around them in the specific way that houses settle when what's inside them is changed, subtly, slowly, in ways you could only identify in retrospect. The stone foyer below was cleaned, the chandelier's absence made strange by the shadows. It had always broken. The marble scored in places that wouldn't fully sand out and would remain there as the specific record of what had happened, visible to anyone who looked. She would not be cleaning that foyer. That was a different person's job now. She was clear on that, had been clear on it since she'd stood in the tunnel under the house with 8 men breathing behind her, and understood that she had crossed a threshold she wasn't going back through. But she found, standing at this window, that she didn't particularly want to. Outside the restored gate, a single car moved along the coastal road, headlights sweeping the dark. And then it was gone. Somewhere in the house, she could hear Vera doing something practical, which was how Vera always marked the end of a crisis, by finding the next useful thing and doing it quietly. Reyes was at the gate. The men who remained were at their posts, doing what they did, and the house breathed around her in the careful way of something that had been through a great deal and was still standing. Cassian turned from the window and looked at her. She looked back at him. He had the face of a man who had more to say and was choosing, for once, to let the moment be enough without filling it. She recognized the effort that took. She appreciated it. She picked up her bag from by the door. "I'm going to sleep," she said. "Ferraro's coming tomorrow. You're going to be still for most of it, and you're not going to argue with him. I make no promises. Then I'll be there to enforce it." Something moved across his face. The expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite anything else, and was, she'd decided, the truest thing about him. "Good night, Cassian," she said. "Good night, Mirelle." She went upstairs. Her room was the same room it had always been. The small wardrobe, the window cracked against the heat of the radiator, the view of the cliff edge and the water beyond. The green dress hung in the wardrobe. She'd left it there deliberately, she realized. Left it when she'd packed and taken only her own things, left it hanging exactly as it had been, because it was not a thing she'd decided the meaning of yet, and she didn't make decisions about things before she understood them. She understood it now. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window and listened to the Atlantic, and she thought about the woman who had arrived here 6 weeks ago with a bag of her own clothes and a laminated list of rules and a talent for being overlooked. That woman had been real. She wasn't ashamed of her. She'd had reasons for being that woman. Practical, honest reasons that came from the actual specific shape of her life, and those reasons didn't disappear because the life around them had changed. She'd carried her mother's care on her back alone because that was what was available to carry it. She'd cleaned floors that held evidence of things she chose not to know because that was the math that worked. She'd made herself invisible because invisible was what kept you safe in rooms where people with power made the rules. She'd been surviving. That wasn't nothing. That was, in fact, everything. The long, unglamorous, underappreciated work of a person keeping themselves and someone they loved alive with the materials available. But she wasn't surviving anymore. She was something else now, something she was still finding the edges of, and the edges didn't frighten her the way she'd expected them to. They felt like the edges of something that had finally been allowed to be its actual size. She turned off the lamp. In the dark, the sound of the Atlantic came through the cracked window. Steady, indifferent, permanent. The same sound it had made the night she'd come here and every night since. The same sound it would make tomorrow and the day after, unchanged by anything that had happened in this house or anywhere near it. She pulled the blanket up and listened to it, and she let it be what it was. Just water, just the world, continuing. She closed her eyes. She slept.